Welcome to Facts Radio, your journey through history begins here. In this episode, we explore the Great Depression, a time when the rhythm of prosperity fell silent, and the world stood on the edge of despair. From the roaring excess of the 1920s to the haunting lines of the unemployed in the 1930s, this is not just an economic story, it's a human one. Lives shattered, hopes rekindled, and a world forever changed. Chapter 1, The Roaring Twenties, a Fragile Mirage. The 1920s were a symphony of progress, jazz, and ambition. America's cities pulsed with energy, factories hummed, automobiles multiplied, and the glow of electric light spread across the nation. It was the age of consumerism, the birth of modern advertising, and the promise that prosperity was eternal. To many, it felt as if the world had finally conquered hardship. But beneath the glittering surface, cracks were already forming. The end of World War I had unleashed not just optimism, but speculation. Ordinary citizens, clerks, farmers, even housewives, poured their savings into the stock market, convinced it could only go up. Radio stations preached the gospel of wealth, and newspapers celebrated every new millionaire. But this wasn't growth built on reality. It was built on credit, on hope, and on fragile confidence. Imagine a world where banks handed out loans like candy, and buying stocks on margin, with borrowed money, became the new norm. It was a financial high, and the entire nation was intoxicated. But as any gambler knows, the higher the stakes, the deeper the fall. Industrial giants thrived on mass production, but wages didn't keep pace. The average worker could not afford the very goods they made. Meanwhile, the agricultural heartland was still struggling. Farmers had borrowed heavily during the war, expecting continued demand from Europe. But when peace returned, so did competition, and prices collapsed. The farmer's dream turned to dust long before Wall Street noticed. By the late 1920s, America was living a contradiction. Cities soared while the countryside suffered. Fortune smiled on the few and teased the many. The Federal Reserve, seeing the boom, raised interest rates, hoping to curb speculation, but the bubble was already too large. It's hard to believe, but in 1929, a typical investor could buy a $10,000 stock portfolio with just $1,000 of their own money. The rest was borrowed. Everyone believed they could get out before the crash. Everyone believed they were smarter than the market. As the decade drew to a close, whispers of instability began to circulate. Some economists warned of an overheated economy, but few listened. How could they? The dance was too loud, the champagne too sweet, the illusion too perfect. Chapter 2, Black Tuesday, the day the music stopped. The morning of October 29, 1929 began like any other. Brokers filled the trading floors, telephones rang, and ticker tapes printed furiously. But something was different. Panic was in the air. Prices had begun to tumble the week before, and confidence, that invisible fuel of capitalism, had started to evaporate. By midday, the market had turned into a scene of chaos. Men in suits shouted, waved papers, and watched fortunes vanish in seconds. Bankers gathered in private rooms, trying desperately to halt the collapse. But it was too late. The sell orders overwhelmed every effort to restore calm. By the end of the day, 16 million shares had been traded, a record number. Billions in value were wiped away, and with it, the illusion of endless prosperity. Outside the New York Stock Exchange, crowds gathered. Some stood silent, others wept openly. Rumors spread of suicides, men who had lost everything leaping from office windows. Newspapers the next day called it Black Tuesday. It was the day America's golden decade died. But the stock market crash was not the depression itself, it was the spark that lit the fire. What followed was a slow, relentless unraveling of the economy. Banks, burdened with bad loans, began to fail. When frightened depositors rushed to withdraw their money, those banks collapsed entirely. There was no federal insurance then. When your bank failed, your savings vanished. Imagine walking to your local bank one morning, only to find the doors locked and a sign reading, "Closed until further notice." For millions, this was not imagination, it was reality. Factories shut down as demand plummeted. Store shelves remained stocked, but no one could afford to buy. Farmers watched crops rot in the fields because it cost more to harvest than to sell. The economy had turned upside down, abundance without consumption, work without wages, need without relief. President Herbert Hoover, a man once hailed as a great engineer, believed the downturn was temporary. He urged Americans to remain confident and avoid panic. But his faith in voluntary action, rather than direct government intervention, would soon prove disastrously misplaced. By the end of 1930, over 1,300 banks had failed. Millions were unemployed. Breadlines stretched across city blocks, and soup kitchens became symbols of survival. The dream of the 1920s was over. The nation had awakened to a nightmare. Chapter 3: Hard Times, Life in the Great Depression. The 1930s were years of endurance, of quiet heroism and silent despair. For those who lived through it, every day was a test of will. The Great Depression wasn't just an economic crisis, it was a psychological one. It reshaped how people saw themselves, their government, and their future. Families lost homes to foreclosure. In cities, entire neighborhoods fell into ruin as businesses shuttered. Men stood in long lines waiting for a day's work that rarely came. In rural America, the situation was even worse. Drought and dust storms ravaged the Great Plains, turning fertile farmland into wasteland. The Dust Bowl, as it came to be known, forced thousands of families to pack what little they owned and head west, searching for hope that always seemed one state away. Imagine a father, once proud and employed, now standing in a soup kitchen line, avoiding his children's eyes as he brings home a small loaf of bread. Imagine a mother sewing old clothes into new ones, telling her children stories of better days. That was America's new normal. In cities like Chicago, Detroit, and New York, tent communities called Hoovervilles sprang up, ironic tributes to the president many blamed for their suffering. Shanties made from scrap wood and cardboard lined riverbanks and empty lots. Inside, families huddled around fires in tin cans, dreaming of warmth, of food, of tomorrow. The collapse shattered trust, not only in the banks but in the very idea of the American dream. Yet, even in the darkest times, humanity persisted. Neighbors shared food. Churches opened their doors. Communities found strength in solidarity. Cultural life didn't die, either. Radio became a lifeline. Americans gathered around glowing dials, listening to comedies, dramas, and the soothing voice of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. His fireside chats gave comfort and direction. For many, it was the only voice that still promised hope. Music and film also offered escape. The jazz and swing tunes of Duke Ellington, the laughter of the Marx Brothers, and the optimism of Hollywood musicals reminded Americans that beauty and joy could still exist, even amid despair. But under the laughter, fear lingered. Every letter from the bank, every empty factory window, every gust of dust carried a reminder: the system had failed. Something deeper had to change. Chapter 4: A New Deal for a Broken Nation. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt took office in March 1933, America was a nation on its knees. 1 in 4 workers was unemployed. Thousands of banks had failed. The country's faith in capitalism, and democracy itself, was faltering. Roosevelt's inauguration speech struck a chord that still echoes through history: the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. From his first days in office, FDR moved with boldness. His administration launched a wave of reforms and relief programs known collectively as the New Deal. For the first time, the federal government took direct responsibility for economic recovery, a radical shift in philosophy. Banks were stabilized through the Emergency Banking Act, and deposits were insured for the first time under the FDIC. The stock market was reined in by new regulations that demanded transparency and accountability. For ordinary Americans, the immediate goal was simple: survival. The Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, put young men to work planting trees, building parks, and restoring the nation's lands. The Works Progress Administration, WPA, employed millions more to build bridges, roads, schools, and even works of art. America wasn't just rebuilding its economy, it was rebuilding its identity. Imagine the pride of a man earning his first honest wage in years, constructing a dam or painting a mural that still stands today. For many, these programs didn't just provide income, they restored dignity. The Agricultural Adjustment Act sought to stabilize crop prices by paying farmers to reduce production. It was controversial, destroying crops when people were hungry seemed cruel, but it was an attempt to restore balance to a chaotic market. Social security was introduced to protect the elderly and vulnerable. Labor laws guaranteed workers the right to organize and demand fair treatment. FDR's policies didn't end the Depression overnight, but they stopped the free fall. Hope returned, slowly, like sunlight after a long storm. Critics accused Roosevelt of overreach, of undermining capitalism itself. But to millions, he was a savior, a leader who dared to act when others hesitated. His fireside chats continued to reassure the nation, transforming the relationship between government and people. By the late 1930s, the economy was recovering, though unevenly. Unemployment remained high, but the sense of paralysis had lifted. The New Deal had not cured every wound, but it had given America something more valuable, faith that the system could still work, that democracy could adapt, that people could rise again. Chapter 5: Shadows Across the World. While the United States struggled to regain its footing, the tremors of the Great Depression rippled far beyond its borders. The global economy, already fragile after World War I, was bound together by debts, reparations, and trade, and when America fell, the shock was universal. Germany, burdened by war reparations and still haunted by defeat, suffered deeply. Unemployment soared, factories closed, and the German mark lost its stability once again. The promise of democracy under the Weimar Republic began to crumble under the weight of desperation. In that vacuum, dangerous ideologies began to grow. Across Europe, political extremism flourished. In Germany, Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party promised strength and revival. In Italy, Mussolini's fascism offered order over chaos. Economic ruin became a breeding ground for rage, and rage sought a leader. The world's wounds were not just financial, they were emotional, psychological, and profoundly human. Meanwhile, Britain faced its own crisis. Industrial regions in the north were crippled by unemployment. Once proud miners and shipbuilders watched as their livelihoods vanished. The empire that had ruled half the world now found itself counting every penny. In France, political instability grew as trade declined. In Asia, Japan's ambitions intensified. With exports collapsing and resources scarce, the military saw expansion as the only solution. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, a move that shocked the world but also revealed a grim truth: economic desperation can drive nations toward aggression. Even the colonial world wasn't spared. Countries dependent on Western markets saw prices for their raw materials collapse. In India, in Africa, in Latin America, poverty deepened, and resentment toward colonial powers intensified. The Depression wasn't just an economic event, it was a global reckoning. Imagine a world map slowly darkening, each continent dimming under the same shadow of despair. Factories silent, currencies collapsing, borders trembling. For the first time in history, humanity shared a collective hardship, interconnected not by prosperity, but by loss. Chapter 6: The Dust Bowl, America's Dark Storm. While the global economy spiraled, a different kind of disaster swept across the American heartland. The Dust Bowl, one of the worst environmental catastrophes in U.S. history, turned millions of acres of farmland into a barren desert. For years, farmers had plowed deep into the Great Plains, encouraged by government policies and high wartime demand. They tore away the native grasses that had anchored the soil for centuries. When drought struck in the early 1930s, the land simply gave up. Winds began to lift the topsoil, carrying it across states in choking, black clouds. Black blizzards, they were called. They blotted out the sun, turned noon into midnight, and forced families to seal windows with rags soaked in water just to breathe. Entire farms disappeared under dunes of dust. Livestock suffocated, crops failed, and the people of Oklahoma, Kansas, and Texas faced ruin. Imagine standing in your doorway and seeing a wall of dust towering miles high, rolling toward you like an ocean wave. The air grows thick. The ground trembles. Within minutes, everything you know is swallowed in darkness. The human toll was immense. Thousands of families packed what they could onto rickety trucks and fled westward, hoping for work in California's fields. But when they arrived, they found a new kind of struggle: discrimination, exploitation, and overcrowded migrant camps. John Steinbeck would later immortalize their journey in The Grapes of Wrath, but for those who lived it, fiction was not needed. The Dust Bowl wasn't just a natural disaster, it was a man-made one, born of greed, ignorance, and short-term thinking. It forced America to confront the fragility of its relationship with the land. In response, Roosevelt's New Deal created the Soil Conservation Service. Farmers were taught sustainable methods: contour plowing, crop rotation, and replanting native grasses. Slowly, painfully, the land began to heal. But the scars, both on the earth and on the people, would remain for generations. When the rains finally returned, they washed over a changed nation. The lesson was clear: prosperity without balance is an illusion, and nature always has the final word. Chapter 7: The Struggle for Justice and Change. The Depression did not only transform economies, it transformed society itself. As hunger and homelessness grew, so too did movements demanding fairness, rights, and dignity. The 1930s became a decade of awakening, where ordinary people began to question not just how they lived, but why they lived under such a fragile system. Labor unions surged in strength. Strikes spread across factories, docks, and mines. Workers demanded safe conditions, fair wages, and the right to organize. The sounds of protest echoed through the industrial cities: chants, songs, and the hum of resistance. In 1935, the Wagner Act enshrined the right of collective bargaining into law. For the first time, the federal government stood openly on the side of the working class. It was a quiet revolution, not fought with weapons, but with words and courage. Women, too, stepped into new roles. With men out of work, many women became breadwinners, entering factories, offices, and service jobs. Figures like Eleanor Roosevelt redefined the idea of public service and compassion, bringing empathy into the halls of power. She traveled the country, listening to the forgotten, amplifying their voices, and reminding her husband and the nation of its moral duty. Racial tensions also came to the forefront. Black Americans were among the hardest hit by unemployment, often the first to lose jobs and the last to be rehired. Yet out of this suffering grew movements for civil rights and representation. The New Deal brought limited but significant opportunities, and voices like those of Langston Hughes and Marian Anderson carried the spirit of resilience into art and song. It's hard to believe, but in the midst of such despair, America was being reshaped, culturally, socially, politically. The Depression revealed injustice, but it also ignited empathy. It tore down illusions but planted the seeds of reform. The country had learned, painfully, that progress cannot rest on the few while the many starve. And in that understanding lay the foundation of a more compassionate nation. Chapter 8: The World at the Edge, Depression and War. As the 1930s drew to a close, the world found itself standing at another precipice. The Great Depression had not only weakened economies, it had weakened democracies. Across Europe and Asia, totalitarian regimes rose from the ashes of economic despair. In Germany, Hitler had seized power in 1933, promising jobs and pride to a broken nation. Through massive rearmament and public works, he ended unemployment, but at the cost of freedom. The Nazi regime thrived on propaganda, fear, and hate. In Italy, Mussolini marched forward with imperial ambitions. In Japan, militarists sought dominance in Asia, their expansion fueled by the hunger for resources the Depression had denied them. The global economy, once interconnected through trade, now fractured into blocks of power. Nations turned inward, imposing tariffs and hoarding resources. International cooperation faded. Fear replaced faith. In the United States, recovery continued, but slowly. By 1938, industrial output was rising, yet full prosperity remained elusive. The country was still haunted by caution, by the memory of loss. But across the Atlantic, something terrible was stirring, something that would end the Depression not through policy, but through war. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, the world was once again plunged into conflict. The Second World War became both the end and the echo of the Great Depression. Massive military production and mobilization reignited economies. Factories reopened, unemployment vanished, and nations geared for survival. It's a grim paradox that humanity's most devastating conflict would become the engine of economic recovery. But history is rarely neat, and progress often comes at an unbearable cost. The Great Depression, in many ways, prepared the world for the challenges ahead. It taught endurance, adaptation, and the necessity of unity. Yet it also revealed how fragile peace can be when fear outweighs hope. Chapter 9: The Recovery and the Rebirth. By the early 1940s, the Great Depression was fading into memory. War had reshaped the global economy, and America emerged as an industrial giant. The assembly lines that once stood silent now thundered day and night, producing ships, planes, and weapons. Jobs returned, but at a heavy moral price, prosperity born from conflict. When the war finally ended in 1945, the world faced a new beginning. The lessons of the Depression lingered in every policy, every institution, every cautious smile. Governments realized that unregulated markets could fail catastrophically, and that the welfare of citizens could no longer be left to chance. In the United States, programs like the GI Bill opened doors to education and home ownership, creating a new middle class. Social security expanded, unemployment insurance became a norm, and the concept of economic safety nets became part of the democratic promise. Globally, new institutions were born: the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and agreements designed to stabilize trade and prevent future collapses. The world sought not only to rebuild, but to learn. But the wounds ran deep. The generation that lived through the Great Depression carried its ghosts for life. They saved every coin, feared every rumor of downturn, and measured success not in wealth, but in stability. Their caution became wisdom for the generations that followed. The Depression had stripped humanity bare, exposing both its weaknesses and its strength. From its ashes rose a determination never to let it happen again, and a belief that compassion and regulation could coexist with freedom and enterprise. The Great Depression ended not with celebration, but with reflection, a silent vow to remember the cost of greed, the fragility of prosperity, and the power of resilience. Final words. The Great Depression was more than an era of economic collapse, it was a test of civilization itself. It revealed how quickly progress can crumble, how fragile hope can be when built on illusion, and how powerful the human spirit becomes when all else is lost. From the crowded streets of New York to the dust-choked plains of Oklahoma, from the factories of Detroit to the breadlines of London and Berlin, millions endured hunger, humiliation, and uncertainty. Yet through that suffering, humanity rediscovered something essential: empathy. It's hard to believe, but from the darkness of the 1930s grew some of the brightest ideas of the modern world: social safety nets, labor rights, environmental conservation, and international cooperation. Out of failure came reform. Out of despair came understanding. When we look back today, we see not only the hardship but the strength: the mothers who fed families from nothing, the workers who stood together, the leaders who dared to try again. They rebuilt not just economies, but faith in each other. The Great Depression reminds us that history's most painful lessons are often the ones that save us. That progress means little without compassion. That every boom carries responsibility, and every crisis a chance to rebuild wiser. The world we live in today, our protections, our prosperity, our peace, all carry echoes of that stormy past. The Great Depression was not just an American story, it was a human one. This has been the Great Depression. Thank you for joining us, and for listening to the stories that continue to shape our world. Thank you for listening all the way through. To support the show and ensure we can continue, please take a moment to subscribe.